And do you want to be the host, Ian?
I do need to put the presentation up, if that's okay, please, Dick.
Uh,
I could share if you want. Would that be easier?
I think you can share your screen, Ian, can't you?
you are now the host, Ian.
Okay.
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 There. Have you got Keynote showing?
Not yet. Takes a few seconds though.
You probably need to get everyone to mute who's not presenting.
Yeah. Can you see my screen yet?
No, we can't see it. So you've hit the share. You hit the share. Ah, here we go. There you got it.
Yeah.
You worked it out. There. Well done. I'll shut up now.
No, it was just it was arguing, it's fighting back. Okay, so okay, let's race gliders. Everything I've learned about GPS triangle racing competitions so far. So why am I presenting this? There's sort of some history here. I started flying when I was 14, which is a long time ago, 43 years ago. Sorry, yeah, 43 years ago. With a Mercury Grebe free flight glider. And as Greg's alluded to, I've done some F3F, F3B, designed a few planes, built a lot of planes, done some F3F, F5J, open class. I think I flew something like 3 Viking races, which is the F3F World Championships before it was adopted by FAI. I was competition director for the last non-FAI event, the Viking race in Wales in 1998. I've flown a few F3F Eurotour events between 2006 and 2018. And in March 2021, I started flying GPS racing. So since then, I've done the Sport Class World Championships, the first one in 2022 with Greg. I then went on and did the 2023 Scale and SLS World Masters, which was an interesting event. I flew a Eurotour later that year. I then did the 2024 Sport Class. Steve Maitland was my teammate there, and that was a fabulous experience. I then did the Eurotour in 2024, SLS down in Tortosa. So that is a very thin potted history of what I've done, what I've been doing. So I've done a lot of competition. Some of the results in F3F were quite good. The GPS results haven't been so good internationally, but it's a tough gig flying with these guys because they've been doing it for a long time. But what I'm going to hope to do tonight is sort of pass on helpful information. I'm going to assume that everybody knows how to fly around the course. I'm going to assume that everybody knows how to thermal soar to a point. And what I'm going to do is pass on stuff that I've learnt that hopefully will make anybody who's thinking of having a go at an international competition, particularly in Europe, a more successful experience than going in cold and finding it quite challenging. Simon's flown quite a lot of international competitions. Greg's flown quite a few competitions abroad. Dave Woods has, and it is a very different environment. So having a lot of pre-prep and some stuff that you know in advance is quite useful. So basically, I'm going to do a bit about what it's like racing in Europe, how it works when there are 8 other planes in the air, which for some people will be a novelty. Preparation for an event, some things you'll think maybe, and hopefully you'll think, oh, well, that's obvious when I say it, but hopefully there'll be some stuff in there that will help you prepare for a big event. The guys down in Australia will probably already do this because they travel huge distances, and it's very frustrating if they get to the end of their huge distance and find they can't compete. Preparing for flights in these competitions is a bit different from normal club flying as well, so I'll cover a bit of that. What is different to the UK? So obviously this is geared towards the guys who fly in the UK who may not have experienced this environment. And one of the questions when we sort of talked about doing this that came out was how to be the perfect spotter. Because when we fly in the UK, we generally fly as a pilot and a spotter together. In other words, we're doing both jobs on our own. And when you go to competition abroad, you're in a team of 2, and there are some things around that that should be sort of touched on tonight. So, why have I put that logo up? What's that got to do with what we're talking about? So AMG is, well, they're branded as part of the Formula One team. They're also motorsport and performance specialists. And what performance is about is something that those of us who have cycled in the past will know about from Dave Brailsford, is the aggregation of marginal gains. So for me, I don't fly enough. What I have to do is I have to concentrate on making sure that the flying I do is maximised. So some of what we're going to talk about, or I'm going to cover today, is about making up for the fact that I don't fly thousands of kilometres every year. I haven't been able to for the last few years because of other stuff. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is how you make the best of what's going on by taking noise out, by taking distraction out. Because what that allows you to do is then look at the bits that you're not so good at, the flaky bits, and you've got a bit more capacity, mental capacity, to concentrate on those flaky bits. So, what is it like to fly GPS in Europe? Well, you need to understand the rules. That sounds really simplistic and really obvious, but you need to look through the rules before you go to competition. The other thing you need to pay attention to is it's a multilingual environment. If there are local rules for an event, you need to make sure that you really do understand how they've been explained, what they really mean, what the implications of those rules are. Because if you fail to do that, you've got a 0 score for a round, which if you've travelled 700 miles, 1,000 kilometres, and you get a 0 score 2 rounds in, that's pretty frustrating. And there are some very easy things to get caught out on. Things like mobile phones being switched on the flight line. You shouldn't do that. So mobile phones in the flight box, they're not allowed. Also, with the big scale events, to make things a bit safer, there's been a introduction of a rule which allows you to apply the motor after you've crossed the start-finish line. But if you apply the motor after you've passed turn point 1, you get a 0 score. So you just have to be really clear about some of the local rules. They're explained on site. you need to make sure that you fully understand them, because obviously English is not the first language of the people organising competition, and German, French, possibly Slovenian are not our first languages. So be really careful about understanding those rules. The other thing that's really significant is you need to be confident about thermal soaring in a group. If you're flying in Europe at these competitions, you're going to be flying with people who have been doing this potentially for 10, 15 years. And they're going to be very confident. They're going to know their planes well. They're going to know how to fly in groups. So you need to get to the point where you are confident thermal soaring in a group. This is an experience thing to a certain extent. But if you can fly with your local flyers and you can all fly in the same thermal roughly at the same height, that is a really useful thing to be able to do. If you've got an F5J plane, go and fly a couple of F5J competitions, because that will definitely give you experience about confidence in thermal soaring in a group. But if you're flying GPS on your own, I don't want to put you off, but it could be a nasty shock when you've got 6, 7, 8 sport class planes, 6, 7 scale class planes scorching around in the same bit of air in the same 50-meter vertical block. And you need to make sure that you're really comfortable in that environment. One of the other things about going to these competitions is that they are 5 days of competition flying, but they're actually potentially 7 or 8 days, long days on the airfield flying. So you actually need to be quite fit to do this. I mean, all joking aside, if you can fly for 6 hours a day, because that's effectively what you could be doing, and walk 10,000 steps in a day, then you're fit enough to do this. If you're not, sign out, go for a walk, go and bang in 10,000 steps tonight. It really is something that, unless you've done it, it will be a shock to the system. I always sleep very well when I'm on these competitions, because it's actually very wearing. You're flying maybe for 4 flights, so you're prepping, looking around at the lift, working out what's going to go on, planning your flight, then you fly, so you get airborne. You've got a half-hour flight, you might relight 2 or 3 times, so you could be flying for 50 minutes with a half-hour working time. The flight line may be 500 meters away from where you keep your planes, and you might end up doing that trip 8, 9 times in the day. And then, of course, your teammate will be flying for the same number of flights that you're flying. So mentally, it's taxing. Physically, it's taxing. So that leads into, you need to understand your physiological and psychological needs. So what foods work for you? Where do you get your energy from? How do you make sure that you stay in your peak performance envelope? And I can think back to the UK Nationals this year, where Simon and I were thermaling in the same thermal, and it was late in the day and I was a little bit underfueled and just didn't have the mental stamina to carry on trying to work the thermal, and just had to make a decision to leave the thermal that Simon and I were both after, because it just wasn't in a position to mentally carry on flying that thermal quite close to Simon. Physiological and psychological needs are really important in this. The other thing about this is what calms you down. Standing on the flight line in what could be 33, 34 degrees for someone from the UK for 8 hours in the day is really tiring. So you need to work out how you manage your physical condition over the course of a 5-day event. But bear in mind that there are 2 days beforehand, which are practice days, and we'll talk about those in a bit. One of the other things that I find works really well for me is you need a system for preparing for a flight. You need something that is absolutely foolproof, that gets you to the flight line with everything in the right place. Greg was talking about why he flies in January and February, to make sure that all of that sort of routine around preparing for flight is ingrained. Getting to the flight line, if it's 500 meters, 600 meters away from where you keep your aircraft, where your campsite is, where the hangar is, and finding you haven't got your headphones and you're late getting there, really massively adds to the stress. It stops you having a look around at how the lift is generating, what the lift cycle is. And it also can eat into your switch on time, where you turn the plane on, make sure everything is working, find out that the speed controller's failed, so you need your spare plane. So if you compound two things like that, you've set yourself up for a really stressful flight, if you even make the flight. One of the other things as well, particularly for us in the UK, is when you go abroad to these events, as I say, I think you guys who are down in Australia will already do this, take the right spares. So I take, for example, I take a motor with a speed controller attached to it as a spare, or I take 3 planes for a 2-plane event, knowing that the motor and speed controller from the 3rd plane can be yanked out and used as a spare. Spare servos, tools that you need. For my scale plane, getting the undercarriage in and out needs a particular, well, it's easier to take the undercarriage in and out by having a particular tool in the toolbox. So I always have that tool in my toolbox. It's a short ratchet wrench, and it just speeds up if you ever need to take the plane apart. So everything that you know about your planes, you need to have absolutely the right tools with you. It's no good them being on the bench in your workshop 700 miles away. So sort of finally on this sort of overview, if you like, at the World Championships, there are practice days, usually 2 of them. And for me, what works is I tend to get within sight of the airfield the day before the first practice day. I scope out where the shops and the supermarkets are. If I'm staying in a hotel, what the route from the hotel to the airfield is. I work out what shape the campsite is, how easy it is to get on and off the airfield, how long it's going to take. And also now on the practice days, I am on site, campsite set up if I'm camping, or planes set up on the morning of the practice day. Even if no one from the organisation has turned up, I'm ready to fly by 10:30 on the first practice day, because you really do need to start flying as soon as you can. So one of the reasons for doing this is we drive from the UK to these events, and they're out in the plains of Germany. They're in the Swabian Alps, or out in the sort of edges of Bavaria. What you may not realise as you're driving to the event is that you've gained 500 metres of altitude. In the UK, we very rarely fly above 50 metres above sea level with our GPS planes. When you rocket up on the continent and you're at 500 metres, that's the sort of height that we're starting the course at in the UK. So the air is different. The way the air behaves is different. The way thermals behave is different. It's a different shape of landmass. Thermal generation is slightly different. The lift cycles are slightly different because we're no longer in a maritime climate when we go to the continent. Now, if you've never flown in those conditions, your brain has no model. You have no mental model of that environment. So you need to train your mind to operate in that different environment. And the way you do that is you fly the practice days. You fly abroad as much as you possibly can, ideally, but by flying practice days, you start to feel where the lift comes from in the airfield, what pattern the lift takes, during the course of the day, because it varies quite a lot during the course of the day. Different parts of the terrain will generate lift during the different parts of the day, where the sun is, where the wind is. Obviously, you might not get to fly all of the possible opportunities, but it gets you used to where everything is on the airfield. It also allows you to get used to where all the visual landmarks are. So it's really important to fly those practice days. As a, for instance, at the sport class World Champs, I did what I generally do, which is I went for a walk around the airfield to understand what the terrain was like away from the flight line. And yes, you can look on Google Maps, which I do, and I look at the terrain and what's going on and the topography, because that's quite useful in terms of lift. But the landing box for the sport class World Champs last year, if you were a little bit further away from the pilot box than was ideal, low, travelling fast through the start-finish line, there was a hedge you could fly into. It was 15, 20 metres high. And if you hadn't walked around the airfield and hadn't really sort of appreciated the shape of the terrain, there was an easy opportunity there to get very surprised by a bit of terrain. So it's really useful to walk around the airfield and understand where the high bits are, the low bits are, where there might be some turbulence to catch you out. Some airfields you don't need to do it because it's flat, and it's flat as far as the eye can see. But on the ones with interesting terrain, it is definitely well worth using the practice days to understand how the landscape works, how the air works, and having a good walk around the airfield. Any questions so far? Okay. Right. So, at the risk of repeating myself, gaggle flying. You need to understand the rules. So the rules here, the rules of conduct to avoid the collisions in the air, you need to be really ingrained with them. Always turn away as per the rules, always avoid a thermal. If you're flying a straight line and there's someone thermaling right overhead on the start-finish line, you have to go around them rather than charging straight through the thermal of your plane. That, to be honest, if you're flying as part of a team, it's really useful because, of course, your spotter can look ahead, and it's quite difficult to do that if you're flying solo, to sometimes look around enough to manage that. But there are some consequences for not understanding the rules of conduct in gaggle flying. You could easily get a 0 score, and you could also be asked to leave the event, which again, if you travelled 700 miles, 1,000 kilometres, and day 2, you do something for the second time, and you get asked to leave the event, is very disappointing. Again, it is in the rules, but it is worth repeating. Barometric height must be visible on your display at all times. For me, I always put it in the top left-hand info box in the Albatross. The competition organisers will walk down the line and they will check that you're displaying a barometric height, and they will also check fixed frequency. And again, these are easy things to forget, get wrong in the heat of the moment, not do, and give yourself a warning or a 0 score. So this is where flying systematically, preparing systematically, doing things in the same way every time makes sure that you have all this base stuff in place. And it seems obvious, but of course we're all tinkerers. We all muck about with our model memories, our settings, our albatrosses. As we go, we're tinkerers, and tinkering is all well and good until you then tinker yourself into a situation where you make a mistake. So one of the tips that I have and I use, I have the voice height from my telemetry. So I run the Albatross with, I run the telemetry decompressed to my Yeti. And I have obviously then got access to the barometric height which I can then use the Yeti to call out for me. The disadvantage of the Yeti is that by default, it says altitude in front of that, which is very time consuming because it's quite slow. So I go into the voice files and I've deleted the altimeter voice file where it says altitude, and I've just wiped that out. So every time I update my Yeti, if it tries to update the sound files, I have to just go back in and delete it. But it means that whenever I push the voice height button, I get a voice readout in my headphones from my Yeti, which tells me the height, so I don't have to look away. So when you're flying in a gaggle, the last thing you want to do as a pilot is look away, because it's very easy to misident your aeroplane, or for things to change and you look up to watch the midair happen. And I think both Greg Lewis and I can tell you some stories about people looking away from their aeroplanes at the wrong point in time and the consequences of that. It's one of those things that allows me to keep eyes on the plane all the time in a gaggle. Having a spotter helps. Your spotter must help. So when you're in a gaggle, your spotter can look around. Your spotter can look where the next thermal is, so you don't have to. But also your spotter can spot people coming into the thermal. And if it's really busy, your spotter can monitor heights, work out who's close to you on height. It's ideal if the person who's close to you on height, the two people that are close to you on height, if they're in the same area of the pilot box, because then you can have a much calmer, quieter, direct conversation with each other about what altitudes you're at, what each other's intentions are, and it just makes it much easier to deal with. So one of the things with flying in a thermal with lots of aeroplanes is if you've been gaining 2 meters a second in thermals without anybody there, when you start flying in a gaggle, you're not going to do 2 meters a second. You might be able to, but the likelihood is you won't be able to, because you will be necessarily not able to get into the real core of the thermal. You will probably be having to take into account other aeroplanes being there. So of course, what you then have to do is, it's different to flying on your own for GPS, where you go, oh, I've gained roughly this much height in 3 turns, and that means the calculation is going to give me this number of laps from this height for my final glide, so I can go now. You need to sort of understand your average. So again, having that displayed on your Albatross would be quite useful, to just understand that when you're flying in gaggles, you're in groups, you're not gaining height as quickly as you would on your own, and that would just slightly change the calculations you have to make. So the last point here really is, you just have to get used to this. You just have to get really comfortable, really chilled about it. At the end of the day, the visual separation is the key. The problem with visual separation is what you might see as visually separated from the right-hand end of the pilot box might not be visually separated to someone who's 20 meters to your left on the left-hand side of the pilot box. Because even though it's only a small difference in terms of where you are on the ground, their perspective will be different to yours. So make sure that you do keep that visual separation. You need to be pretty calm when you're flying in these sort of groups. As I've sort of put it in my notes, don't be a liability in thermals. If you're yanking and wanking around inconsistently in thermals, you will be a liability. You will cause a problem. You need to keep your thermal turns fairly responsible. You need to be pretty aware of the aircraft around yours and manage it really well. Again, if you're used to doing this, all of this stuff is sort of a moot point. You're already used to doing it. But if you're relatively inexperienced, you need to just build up your confidence and your comfort. And sometimes, actually, no, it's okay to leave a thermal and go. You might actually get a better go around the course if you go before everybody else, especially if you're spotter or you have worked out that there's some lift further on that can get you away. You might get 2 or 3 turns before everybody follows you to gain a bit of extra height a bit further around the course. It's much better to be cautious than to take the chance as well, because the reality of it is no one wants mid-air. Okay, any questions to this point?
We have a question from Greg Fitzpatrick.
Yes.
And he has a vested interest in this because he might be dabbling his toes in a trip to Europe at some point. And it's a really good question. So when you're on you're flying and you've got your spotter and you're in a thermal with some other people, and you start calling out the altitudes, do they do that one? And 2, what language do they do it in, typically in an international competition?
Okay, so good questions. Yeah. So generally, as soon as anybody who's not German or Swiss turns up at the airfield at the international competitions, the international language is English. So everybody communicates in English. It's very useful. I'll talk about this later, but it's very useful to have some other languages at your ear tips rather than fingertips. And people do call out the altitudes. Now, I'm going to talk about this a bit later, Greg, so I'm not putting you off, but the reality of it is calling out your altitude as you go into a thermal is a bit immaterial. You sort of need to give people a bit more of a hint. And it gets easier the more you do this, because you tend to recognize the aeroplane. You tend to recognize the pilot. You might be standing next to the pilot and you get to know people. Having a spotter who's experienced and a pilot who's inexperienced is actually quite a good thing, because the experienced spotter will probably know some of the other pilots. They've got a little bit more time to understand who's flying what aeroplane. And even if they don't recognize the aeroplane's colors, they can have a quick glance down the flight line and work out who's looking where. So yes, people do call out the altitudes, but you need to give a bit more than that as well. I am going to talk about this as well a bit more with the spotter. So yeah, calling out the altitudes is done. It can be a bit distracting. Whereas if you're stood next to someone, and there have been a couple of times where Andreas Kunz and I have been stood next to each other, and we can recognize each other's aeroplanes. And I've said to Andreas, "Oh, I'm going into a right-hand thermal turn in about 1 second," and he said, "Yep, I'll follow," because he's spotted that we're both entering into some lift. But I've been in front and would have theoretically turned across in front of him. But it's just that dialogue that goes on. So some of that does come with experience. Some of it just comes with understanding what's going on. But if in doubt, yeah, you just call out your altitudes and call out where you are and what you're about to do. So going into a thermal, you might say, coming into the thermal, 450 meters. It gives anybody who's at the same altitude a chance to say same, which at least gives you a chance to identify who your opponent is at that level in the thermal. Does that answer your question, Greg? F.
Probably muted.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're going to do Q&A at the end as well. So if people, there's more to add, or people have got supplementary on that one, we can come back to it. So just keep going.
Yeah. Sure. Okay. So preparation for the event. So I'm already in the middle of doing this for 2 events this year. So competition bulletins come out. The first event that I did abroad, the competition bulletin was not as thorough as I have been used to from some of my F3F internationals. So I asked a bunch of questions, and that sort of relied on the fact that I've done quite a few international competitions. The competition bulletins, there's a sort of small version of the one from 2023 in Neresheim there. They've got lots of very useful information in. It's not just about accommodation. It's things like, have you got power on site? Any local rules? Any altitude restrictions that there might be? You might already get a view of where the safety areas are, the no-fly zones are. And all of that stuff's really useful, particularly things like no-fly zones. So as an absolutely perfect example of this, at Neresheim, the safety zone is right behind the pilot box. And by right behind the pilot box, I mean it's within 20 meters of the pilot box, probably less than that. So if you're not used to flying in that environment and you've never flown at Neresheim before, it's very easy as you fly from turn 3 to turn 1 to stray quite close to that no-fly zone. And you think, oh, I'll never stray near a no-fly zone. But when you're flying overhead, you're flying minimum sync, so the aeroplane's not maybe flying at its most responsive. You're looking ahead. You're working out whether there's any thermal activity at turn 1. And then you look up and you suddenly find your aircraft has drifted back over the line between turn 3 and turn 1. And you touch the safety zone. Ask me how I know. But it wasn't just me. Even someone like Manfred Rumer, who's an exceptional pilot, Manfred got a 0 score by touching that safety zone. So the thing is, once you know that those safety zones exist, you can then go and set your practice course up at your local field with very similar constraints. And you can practice flying like that. So if you're really used to flying right over your head, and then you touch safety zone, you think, okay, well, that really could happen to me, so I will modify my flying. And it's very easy to get around these things, but you can go and practice these things by extracting information out of these bulletins. So prior to an event, quite often we get an RC electronics update. So for a month before the event, I check every day to see if Andre has put a new event out. Usually in the competition bulletin, it will tell you what version is going to be used in the competition as well. So as soon as that becomes available, it goes on everything. I update all of my kit, I test it, I go and have a flight with every aircraft and make sure that they are all working properly. Because, yeah, I have rocked up at a big event having not done that, and yes, it worked fine. But imagine you rock up and you end up spending your first practice day sorting out what is an easily solved problem a month before the event. Also, in the competition bulletin, it'll tell you the current set of rules that are going to be used. And most of the time, that's not an issue. But going forward into the light class worlds this year, I suspect there will be a difference between the rules that are potentially coming for light class versus the rules that will be flown at that competition. So it's well worth keeping up to date on that and making sure that you're really clear that you've got the right rules on your iPad, tablet, whatever, that you're going to use for the event. Okay, course file downloaded. Make sure that it actually loads. You don't want to be having that problem again during the run up to your practice days or during your practice days. I mean, in the UK, we have had people who've had the wrong course file loaded at events, and we've been able to accommodate it. At a big event in Europe, it won't get accommodated. It's really not worth it. And it's also extra workload on someone like Andre, who's a competitor. Andre is not providing support at these events. Andre is competing. So it's actually completely unfair to go to Andre and say, can you sort this problem out with my Albatross, when you can do it yourself in the run up to the competition. So I mentioned this earlier. Look at the venue. If there's Google Maps and there's a road near the event, go and have a look at the street view for Google Maps. Have a look at the topography. Have a look at the satellite imaging. Have a look at everything you can online that tells you about the airfield. Because there are lots of hints that will help you acclimatise to flying in a different place that you may never have flown at before, at an altitude you may never have flown at before, that will help you adjust. So a classic example is at Zell, where the sport class was last year. We were effectively facing out over a shallow slope dropping away from us. And behind us, that shallow slope, it was actually steep enough that I had to get off and virtually push my bike up the hill, went up to quite a steep escarpment behind us that dropped off. So that was perhaps 100 meters above our heads, the peak of the hill. So when the wind was coming from behind us at that particular event, we were stood there thinking, oh, it's not that windy. But at 300 meters, that wind direction and that wind was really apparent. And crosstail paradigms really showed how strong that wind was. They came around turn 3 and pointed to the right because the wind was so strong. It was a crosswind. And whilst we were stood in relative calm, the aircraft were 300 meters above our head and in 22 meters a second of wind. So understanding the terrain is really important. Also understanding the terrain, you're going to Europe from the UK to fly some of these events in Germany or Switzerland is going to be very different because there's not only the topography, but you will have big forests. You will have fields, buildings with solar panels on, all sorts of features that can play into lift and sink sources. So you can do a lot of prep prior to getting to the event to understand where lift is going to be, where there might be sink at certain times of the day, where there's going to be lift at certain times of the day. And that is really important prep. Obviously, if there are several of us going to a competition, it's something that we can do together as a team. We can pull all that information up, pool our views, have a conversation. And then, of course, you can use the practice days to go and try that out, work out whether or not your assumptions are correct, refine your assumptions, work out what your tactics are for dealing with things. I mean, one of the things about the altitude, I think Greg Lewis would attest to this, was we had some nasty shocks at the sport class world champs, the first one, with the speed that thermals disappeared going upwards. They just went up so much faster than we're used to because they were starting 500 meters above sea level, and we'd never flown in thermals that far off the ground, or that far above sea level. So the difference in air pressure was sufficient to make our nip the turn, go back for the thermal, not work in certain circumstances. Okay, so check out the locale, knowing where the shops are, knowing where the cash point is, knowing whether or not there's a model shop locally. If you're staying in a hotel, knowing where the restaurants are, if you're not taking advantage of the any catering facilities on site. Knowing where stuff is really important because you will not have very much time. If you've got to be at the airfield for 8 o'clock, ready for an 8:30 briefing, ready to fly at 9 o'clock, and you don't finish flying until 6 o'clock, or the last flight starts at 6 o'clock, which is a potential. So you're not leaving the airfield potentially until 7:30 if you're staying off site. Means that you need to know where you can go and get stuff. You need to plan how you provision. You need to make sure that you've got no anxiety about running out of water, booze, microwave meals, Mars bars, whatever is going to stress you out. Understanding how long it takes you to get to and from. Understanding that if you're there on your own, how you're going to manage that. If you're there with 2 or 3 other people, whether or not there's a way of doing a midday run away with someone who's not flying for 40 minutes, 50 minutes. Can they get out and back? It sounds really simplistic, but until you've actually been in the heat of the moment, things like that can generate a level of anxiety which affects your competition performance. So anybody who's planning on doing an event this year, if you're not planning on staying on site, book your accommodation now. I would say book it using booking.com from the UK because the cancellation policy is really good. You don't want to be leaving your accommodation booking late because a lot of these airfields are in rural areas and there's a limited amount of accommodation available. So again, it's early prep, something that both Greg and I do. As soon as we book the event, we tend to work out what our accommodation is, and within a week or 2 of entering the event, I've got something arranged. I know what I'm doing in terms of accommodation. Okay, prep for an event. So Steve Maitland and I think Steve's with us tonight. Steve and I had a look at our record of flying, and mine was woeful in comparison to his. Obviously, if you want to be really good, you need to be like Martin Winter and you need to fly 10,000 kilometers before you go to an event in a year. But ideally, you do need to fly a good amount. The flying needs to be really instinctive. You need to be really well practiced. You need to be really well versed in what you're doing. So I know Greg Fitzpatrick, who's on the call, is looking at doing sport class. Greg, you fly more than enough to be really confident in your flying. However, one thing I would say is don't just fly your plane as a GPS plane. Fly it for fun. Really know how it flies. So some people have seen me fly my light class plane and I treat it as an aerobatic aeroplane. It's chucked around more than it's flown on the GPS task. The sport class planes I'm tending to fly nearer the edges of the envelope. You need to be really comfortable with your aeroplane and you need to fly the course as well and know exactly how your plane is going to behave. But also it's just your comfort in flying around the course, knowing where you can take your eyes off the aeroplane, knowing where your particular colour scheme is a bit difficult to see in certain lights and at certain angles means that you will know that the more you fly, and it will give you the confidence to go, okay, well, I can't really look away from the plane there, but I know when I round this particular turn, I can always see the plane. So that's my time to have a look around and be able to easily pick the plane up. Okay, and again, I'm going to say it again, you need to understand the rules. There are so many really simple, easy ways of getting a 0 score. So the key thing with the bulletin or the bulletins that come out is the local rules, the safety areas, any altitude limits, anything that you can set up and make sure is working 100% before you get to the event. Things like it's not a 750 meter limit, it's a 650 meter limit that's been applied locally. So before you even go to the event, stop flying to 750 meters, get used to flying to 650 meters. So it's stuff like that that you can do before you go to the event that will stand you in good stead and get you instinctively at your peak performance for that event. So any questions before I move on?
We have got one question, but I'd take it. So Stephen Weatherston asked a very good question, and I'll tell you what it is. So because you are capable of multitasking, unlike most men, Ian. It's how to set up your albatross altitude call on demand for the jetty, but we'll do that at the end.
Yeah.
I think so. Just keep going.
Okay, I was thinking that we might actually do that. We'll talk about that at the end. I think we might do that as a second session.
Okay.
Some of the more in-depth stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think everyone knows we're going to have a separate session, more like in the pub. Anyone, just firing questions backwards and forwards. I think it'd be great to try to handle that a bit tonight. So maybe Steve can have a dabble with it, and if he cracks it, he cracks it. If he doesn't, but I think that sort of thing would be really good for the next session as well. So, but so keep going, and we'll come back to that one at the end.
Right. So you're at the event and you're about to go and fly. So I mentioned earlier, so far my experience with all of these events is that you're never going to walk less than 200 meters from where your aircraft is to where you're flying. Quite often you might be walking 500 or 600 meters as a minimum. So when you walk down to the flight line, you need to be pretty well prepared. So the first thing about preparing for flight is briefings. There's usually a briefing in the morning, even if there's nothing to brief. It might be a very quick briefing. It might be 30 seconds where the competition director says, thank you very much, everybody, for yesterday. You all flew really well. It was all considerate. You all obeyed the local rules. And some of those local rules might be to do with how you climb out. And this is why things like the briefings and the GPS bulletins for the event and the pre-event briefings are really important, because you might get told when you launch and you climb outside of turn 3. For this event, we will not allow anybody to fly inside turn 3 in the climb out for safety reasons. So all of that stuff you need to take on board, and anything that changes during the event, the briefings will cover that in the morning. You might get a new course file halfway through the event, which does happen. There might be a fault with the course file, and we might have got through the first day okay, but there might be something that's causing a problem with RC model spot, and Andre does get called in to issue a new course file. You will not find that out unless you've attended the briefing, or at least one of your team of 2 has attended it, fully understood, grilled anybody on anything that they don't think is clear. You've discussed it, decided you don't understand it, gone back and found the competition director and checked your understanding. All of this stuff is really sort of obvious, but in the heat of the moment, some of these obvious things do just drop down through the cracks. So it's all about making sure that you really comfortably know what's going on and you're avoiding the possibility of getting a 0 score for a flight. So when you get down to the flight line, you don't want to be getting down to the flight line just as the working time begins. In an ideal world, yes, you want to be calm and comfortable when you're walking down to the flight line, but you want everything started up, ready to rock and roll. With sport class, I like the fact that I've got sport class planes that if I do rock up and the working time has begun, it's not a problem, because so long as everything's ready to fly, I can get to 500 meters with my sport class planes in 35 seconds. So there's 0 anxiety about getting in the air and getting into the course in a reasonable period of time in the start window. It's not that way with scale, and it's certainly not that way when I fly SLS with my Quintus. So being well prepared, being in the right place at the right time, having everything fired up, knowing everything is going to work, will absolutely make you a lot calmer when you're flying. And there's a perfect example of this that happened at the World Champs that Steve Maitland and I were flying in. I had been having a few issues with the speed controller in my A plane, so I decided that on the Thursday I'd fly my B plane. So test flew it on the Wednesday night. just to double check that everything was exactly as it was on the practice days. Flew beautifully, wanged it around the sky, had a very nice couple of flights with it, did some aerobatics, flew a few courses, flew the best indexing I'd ever flown with that plane, landed it, put it in the hangar, charged the receiver battery up. Steve and I down on the flight line, well in advance, preparing for the flight, and I plug the thing in, I fire it all up, and the receiver doesn't work. No RF. Luckily, I hadn't taken the A-plane apart, so Steve very kindly ran back to the hangar and grabbed my second plane. But because we were down there in time, it meant that we were actually fairly calm getting airborne. We were in the start window when we launched, and I got a flight, and I got an 880 score. So it wasn't a loss, it wasn't a total disaster. But I have, because of a technical failure, and I was slightly pushed getting to the start line when I had a bit of a technical issue with my Quintus at a competition, I ended up crossing the start-finish line half a second after.
Okay, we seem to have lost Iain. Well, at least I have. Has everybody else lost him?
I'll text him. Probably he's actually texting me. Let's see what it says. He's probably got a power cut. He lives in down on the south coast. You know, it's pretty unsophisticated down there. Oh yeah, he's had a power cut, but the power's come back on. So it'll take about 20-30 seconds for his Wi-Fi to reboot and things, I would think.
So
Okay.
he didn't have that one covered in his preparation, did he?
He's just going to attempt to try us. I'll get ready to hand the host back to him as soon as he reappears.
So whilst we're waiting for Iain, has anyone got, because I am writing the questions down, does anyone want to sort of throw the hand up and say, I've got a question for the end, and I can write it down now?
It's not really a question, it's an observation from doing lots of F3F world champs and things like that, as you probably found, Greg. Just to reiterate what Iain says about the psychological sort of aspects, the stress, the mental stress of these things. I mean, I've been at events with some very strong team members who've been in tears just, you know, when they've had a bad round, and it can really affect you. So yeah, should never be underestimated, the you know, the mental awareness and mental preparation for any of these sorts of long events. And as Iain says, you know, 5 to 7 days on an airfield is grueling, absolutely grueling. Great fun. You know, you look back on it and it's fantastic, and it's fantastic a lot of the time, but it is grueling. Anyway, I'll hand back in case we got Iain back.
Yeah, I think, well, you know, I'm contemplating going to a Eurotour event, mainland Europe this year, and I think Greg F might join me. I mean, I think the beauty of those is they're weekend events, and you can get on the field on the Friday and have a practice. They're pretty good. I think when you then go up to the next level to a World Masters event, and you know, we've got the Aussie guys on, and it's a hell of a trip for them to come over to Europe and do these events. You know, so preparation is key. But yeah, 5, 6, 7 days. I mean, when we did the one in Ulm, the first one we did, you know, the things that we weren't prepared for. One was the thinness of the air, as Iain sort of states. Luckily, at that point I was quite physically fit, and the temperature didn't bother me. But Iain was going through a bit of a bad time with his arthritis, and he really struggled with the intensity of the temperature. And we were very lucky that we'd prepared for that, and we got an easy up we've got actually quite a nice tent with open sides. We would have been dead in the water if we hadn't had that. You know, it was so hot, the sun was so bright, and because you're higher up, the sun is actually got more intensity because the UV is stronger. So yeah, just echoing your point, Simon. But I think the 2-day Euro tours with the GPS events are probably a bit less intense and a bit more manageable. So you know, I would say don't be put off by it, but you have to be ready for it. Ian, you're back.
Yeah, sorry about that. Everything blinked out for a moment, and obviously, it takes a while for the internet to come back as well.
That's right.
We did
want to pay as you go.
We did joke about your preparation, Ian.
Yeah, no, it was just like thunk.
Is that because Rachel B's cut your winter payments?
Yeah, that's it. Unfortunately, I suspect that probably means that someone in my area is going to be without power for 24 hours because one of the joints in the road has gone foot. So hopefully we're back in the room.
Yeah.
Cool. So it's interesting. I sort of came in on the end of that, Greg, and you were talking about it. I sort of concur with what you were saying about this is why I say you need to be fit. You need to be well aware. I do agree that having the gazebo, the outside shelter was really useful. If I'm camping on site using my van, I have some space to go with some shade. And it really is, for us in the UK, it's something we're not used to. We're not used to that 35 degrees. And it might not be sunny. It might be slightly overcast and 35 degrees. And it's absolutely knackering, just physically. The scale event at Neresheim, absolutely shattering, being in 35 degrees for 3 days. Because, of course, you think, oh, I'm drinking enough, but you actually just need to ramp it up a hell of a lot more. Otherwise, you're suddenly really tired. And yeah, having some shade is really important. Guys in Oz absolutely know that. I mean, they have clothing choices. In fact, I have an Australian-inspired clothing choice for when it is that hot and when it is the UV is that high. It's a fashion pièce de résistance, but it is perfect for what you need. It keeps your neck out of the sun. It keeps the sun off all of your skin. It offers you some shade whilst you're flying, which you do need. Anyway, so I think we'd got as far as getting everything prepared, systemize your approach, do everything in the same way, have a little process that you have practiced. Greg touched on it earlier, the reason he flies in January and February. You just keep reinforcing that system, which means that all of the little detail things that you do to go flying in what's a different environment, your batteries are in a different place, your transmitter is in a slightly different place, you're not flying at your local field. So, for example, you fly at Phoenix near London and you have the same spot that you get to, you put your plane together in the same place, you use the same charging connectors on the tables, you're really used to that environment, which is fine, but make sure that you systemize how you prepare, how you charge everything, because some things in that system will get changed when you are on an airfield that is foreign to you. I fly at quite a few places now. I've just joined another club to fly somewhere different. So it's about changing what I'm looking at, learning how to pick up on visual clues when I'm flying, but also just to make sure that all of that sort of underlying systemization of your process when you finish a flight. What do you do when you finish a flight? Well, clean the smeg off the aeroplane straight away. If you've got a receiver battery in it, put the receiver battery on charge. Do the same thing every time. Make sure your stuff is in the same place. Make sure that you really trust it. Make sure that stuff that you use a lot, you have a spare with you. So if you've got a charge lead that goes from a particular charger to a particular battery, don't just have one charge lead. Make sure that you've got a spare that works in that combination. If needs be, chuck that single charger away if it means that you've got to have spare leads so that you can have common leads across all of your chargers. That means that you can potentially have 4 or 5 leads that you can use as spares for parts of your system, and you can put in place so that when you're on the flight line or when you've finished flying and you do something, it's all part of that system. And if anything fails, you've got spares to make sure that you don't have to change your system. It sounds really basic, all of this stuff, but it just takes all of that noise and all of the stress. I'm going to tell you a story about one of the really good flyers in GPS a little bit later, that highlights one of the reasons why they're such a good flyer. So, as I say, I have a set of things that I do when I finish flying. I have a set of things that I do when I go to start flying. If there are some local things that come into effect because I'm at a different location and I'm flying at a competition where I need to slightly flex that, the practice days allow you to prepare for it. And then you get used to it. And by the time you're flying in competition, it becomes second nature and you're doing the same thing. You know what needs to be in your pockets. You know what you need to be doing in different phases of your prep and your pre-flight checkout. Again, those of us who've done quite a lot of competing internationally, we sort of take it for granted. But if you're doing this for the first time, just little things like this make things much, much easier and much, much less open to error. And if you make a little error, it plays on your mind. You will think about it. It will affect your performance. It will be noise whilst you're flying a competition flight. You can take that noise away. So, spare plane. Now, where is your spare plane? Where do you want it when you're flying? Where do you want it when you're prepping? So, sat up at the hangar might not necessarily be the best place for it. But do you want the risk of having your spare plane out in 40 degrees of temperature in the sun, heating up? Because the avionics won't like being sat in that temperature. So you need to have a bit of a plan and you need to be prepared for the need to call on your spare plane if you take a spare plane with you to some of these events. Ideally, and it's easy to do with sport class and light class, your A plane and your spare plane need to be very similar in terms of some of the kit that they carry. So most of my installs, most of the kit that I put in my planes is universal for sport class. So I can take a motor and a speed controller out of one and chuck it in another. But it also means that if the spare plane is close by and say the nozzle for your compensation gets damaged, you can just go to your spare plane, pull the nozzle out of that, plug it into your other plane. But if you've got one of Andre's pitot heads in one plane and you've got a Schambeck pitot head in another plane, I would seriously contemplate swapping one of them out so that you've got the same pitot head for both planes. Stuff like that is just critical to making your world a lot easier to deal with. Also, can you swap very quickly and easily to your spare plane? Do you use the same flight batteries? Can you just take this flight battery out of one plane and put it into another? If you've got a spare plane and you've got different flight batteries between those two planes, you need to build that into how you prepare for a flight. and how you work it. If you're fairly chilled about it and you're not overly worried about winning, then maybe it's less of an issue. But if you want to perform as well as you can, make sure that your spare plane is easily usable, because you can go from one plane to another prior to launch, and get yourself a flight if you have a problem with the plane that you're planning on flying. So it's just stuff that you need to think about. So what stresses you out? Everybody's different. I mean, my natural sort of state of operation requires a certain level of stress, I realised, but not too much. And it's very interesting because I've got to know Andre quite well and talk to him about how he approaches these competitions. So Andre Vrecker is a very accomplished pilot. I mean, I reckon that you could give him an ironing board and he'd get it round a scale class competition flight pretty effectively. He might not win, but he'd certainly be midfield even with an ironing board. He's a very competent, capable pilot. But Andre disappears from the flight line. As soon as he's finished flying, he does everything that he needs to make sure his plane is ready for the next flight. He makes sure that he's got charged batteries. He makes sure that the plane is functional and ready to go. If he needs to charge anything, it goes on charge. And then, generally, he disappears. He goes and sit and read a book in the shade, drink some water, chill out. He's very calm, very centered. The thing is, as he said, when he first started doing this, he was on the flight line all the time. He was having a chat to everybody. He was socializing with people. And he suddenly found that he was getting 2/3 of the way through the day and he was worn out and he wasn't able to perform at his best. And the reason that we're doing these competitions is to perform at our best and get as good a result as we can. Wherever that puts us in the field, we want to feel that we've done ourselves justice. So you need to work out what stresses you out, what interferes with you giving your best performance, and you need to turn the noise down on that. So again, let's take, for example, a real world example. We've got John Greenfield on the call with us. So John's very used to being on an airfield all day, being very engaged, very entered into this because he runs the Ghost Squadron events. He's used to operating in that environment, but a lot of us are not. We're not used to flying for 6-7 hours a day. We're not used to being on an airfield all day. We're not used to doing this for 5 or 6 days on the trot. So we have to work out ways of creating capacity in our physical and psychological being. So don't ever underestimate these sort of external stresses. For me, I tend to minimize the socializing during the competition day now because it's very distracting. It's very easy to miss your flights. So what you also need to do is you need to take out some of the stress by fully understanding when your flights are going to be, what time you need to be at the flight line, how long it's going to take you to get from where you're storing your plane to the flight line so that you can prep in advance. It's all stuff that is just about getting the best performance for that 50 minutes of each flight. Okay, what's the plan, Stan? So prep for the flight is also about working out where your best place to stand in the pilot box is for you. Working out who you don't want to stand next to. Working out how long you want to be behind the pilot box prior to your flight, looking at the lift pattern, looking at the cycle of lift, seeing what's going on, how much use you're going to get out of it, whether you're going to use any information that's on your phone prior to flying. I'm going to come on to that in a minute. But you need to have a plan. Rocking up launching and working it out as you go along. Whilst it does work, and to be fair, the UK Nationals last year, I was always on the back foot because I flew both classes. I was a bit late arriving to the event. I didn't settle down at all during that day. I didn't have a chance to even blow my nose. And yeah, it worked okay, but it would have worked a lot better had I had the ability to make a bit of space before each flight to have a look around, work out what the lift cycle was doing, where we were in the day, where the lift sources might be for that point in time in the day. Also, it's just very calming. It just means that you can approach your flight knowing that you've done everything. You've got no niggling doubts. You know roughly what you're going to do when you start. And yes, you might change your plan, but at least you're going into a flight with a clear purpose, an understanding of what you're going to aim to achieve, who you're going to watch. You might decide that you're going to mark a particular couple of pilots. You might decide you're not going to bother to do that. You're just going to fly your own flight. But you need to have that plan in place. You might have the same plan for every flight, but you also then need to share that plan with whoever's helping you, with your helper, your spotter, your coach, however you care to label them. You need to be working as a team so that you both know what your common purpose is at the point in time that you go for the pilot box. You know what job each of you is going to do in that prep time. Who's going to put the tripod up with the sun disk and the tablet, where things are going to go. If you need someone to launch for you, because I still have a problem with my right wrist. Well, I'm always going to have a problem with my right wrist, which makes launching sport class planes probably an impossibility because the ligament damage in my right wrist is such that I can't launch 7 kilograms at the moment. So you need to have all of those things in place and be pretty chilled about doing that and not having to rush it. So having a plan in place really does help as part of your prep. So any questions so far?
We've got some questions, but I think they're more pertinent at the end.
Okay.
So just keep then there's some really good questions actually. So just keep going at the moment.
Okay, right. So vive la difference. Right. So this is sort of a bit of a wrap up of where we've got to and some thoughts. Obviously, everybody has different motivations for their going competing. I've always enjoyed competing internationally. I've got friends all over the world as a result of doing it. I've got people that have similar interests. They have different culture. We can sit down and have a beer and we can sort of find out about each other's different worlds. And it's very, very enjoyable, that whole sort of social thing that comes around it. But why do you want to fly abroad? What's different about flying abroad? And I'm sort of going to summarize some of the stuff I've gone over. The altitude we fly at when we go abroad is massively different to what we're used to in the UK. And to be honest, I suspect it's probably different to what some of the guys in Australia are used to. If you're flying Western Australia, as I understand it, you're quite near sea level. So again, going and flying in Europe, there will be a difference to how the aeroplane gets set up. And that changes the way you fly. It expands the way you fly. It helps you fly better. You're much better able to cope with new things because you've widened the model that you can call upon. You loaded more information into your brain and your mental model. And flying at different altitudes helps you set your aeroplane up in a slightly different way, and I think a better way, and you start to understand what you can get away with your aeroplane. Okay. When you fly in these competitions, as I've said, the safety zones are going to be different to what you're probably used to in any of the local UK competitions and any of the local UK sites. But you can practice that. You can set up some of the things that are going to get you. I've talked about Neresheim, but Tortosa, when we fly the SLS competitions, the safety zone is set up at 150 meters behind the pilot box. And you only need a 3 or 4 degree deflection caused by the crosswind that is nearly always blowing the plane back towards the safety zone to clip the safety zone when departing towards the north. So you can clip the safety zone on takeoff. So you can set up a safety zone where you can have some crosswind effect for your self-launching scale plane to practice guaranteeing that every time you launch and take off from the ground, you miss the safety zone because you practice getting the takeoff right in a crosswind. And maybe this is a good time to talk about it. Flying locally, we probably are not as rigid at enforcing things like the landing zone, how you take off. When you go and fly abroad, this applies much more to the scale planes, but when you're flying abroad, the number of times that I have now taken off with 90-degree crosswinds, landed with 90-degree crosswinds, ended up having to land with a slight cross tailwind. Those are things that you might not necessarily practice in your local flying field. So learning about it at a big international competition is quite exciting. But knowing what I know now, I would say that anybody who's planning on flying scale, particularly, you need to be thinking about practicing this. But also, if you're flying sport class, it's a bit hairy, and some airfields, some flying clubs, it won't be possible to do. But you know what? Practice a couple of downwind landings or cross downwind landings where you maybe got the wind at 100 degrees rather than 90 degrees. Practice crosswind landing because you will need to do it. So learn how to do it in the safety of your own environment rather than finding out about it when 6 other aeroplanes are trying to get onto the landing zone. And you put your grow flap out and the aeroplane doesn't really slow down in terms of ground speed with everybody watching is not a great thing to do. So I'm not saying this to put you off, I'm just saying you can prepare for this. So pilot box, I talked about that briefly. Pilot box is really important, knowing where you want to stand. For me personally, I like to stand quite near the start-finish line. However, if you've got someone who's really noisy from one of the Eastern European states who speaks really loud, having them right next to you might discourage you from standing there. So you might want to stand at the other end of the pilot box. Obviously, that then gives you a slightly different view of the airfield to the one that you might have flown for 5 or 6 days. So on the practice days, it's actually worth standing in your preferred position and then go and fly a couple of rounds from the other end of the pilot box, just so that you're used to that subtle change in the visual cues you get that you pick up subliminally. Pilot box is really important. I mean, hopefully you've seen from the photos as well, it's very rigidly enforced. There is a very defined pilot box. There is a line of tripods. There's no standing in front of everybody else. Everybody is on the same line in the pilot box. It's something that you get used to fairly quickly, but it can be quite congested. And again, maybe that's something that locally in the UK, we need to enforce a pilot box that's the right size for the number of pilots that we've got to force a bit more comparable experience for people who want to go and fly these competitions abroad, just so that they're used to it. It's not a huge problem. It's just something that you just need to get used to. And certainly with 2.4, we've got very out of the habit of all standing next to each other. I mean, in the days of 35 and even 27, Meg, we were used to standing in quite close proximity and being aware of some of the constraints around that. Landing box, I have sort of touched on this a couple of times. I don't think there's anything more to be said about get used to it, learn how to get into it with unfavourable wind conditions. It'll make your competition world much easier to deal with. The amount of time on the field, when my power blipped, I came back and you guys were sort of talking about some of the effects of that. Take a seat, make sure that you've got somewhere to sit down, make sure you've got some shade, make sure you fuel up, make sure you've got plenty of water. The physiological effects of the time on field are not to be underestimated. Your brain is working pretty hard all of the day, so make sure that you are fueling it. If Red Bull is your thing, caffeine is your thing, energy drinks, bananas, whatever it is, make sure that you're fueling the brain box, because the moment you fail is the moment you have to leave a thermal that you would really like to work, but realize that you're not actually fit to work, so you can lose points. This is a new thing, but this is a really stark difference between flying in the UK and flying abroad. We quite often end up flying on airfields which are mixed use. We end up flying on airfields that are club airfields. They've got a light aircraft fleet of 5 to 50 light aircraft, hot air balloons, gliders. So during the event, obviously that won't happen. But after the event, you might want to do some test flying. You might want to just fly for fun. You need to just appreciate that they're mixed use airfields. If you're not used to that environment, you need to find out what the rules are and how it works. So last year in Zell, on one of the days, the flight controller was quite happy for me to fly whilst people were taking off and landing in the full-size aircraft. We had just agreed a place that I would keep my aeroplane whilst they were doing takeoff and landing. On another day, the flight controller and the chairman of the club were unhappy with people flying whilst they were doing takeoffs and landings, so we all landed. You just need to be aware of that if you choose to fly. It's very interesting. It's quite good fun flying on an airfield where there is such a positive view of all types of aviation. And it works really well. So hang on, sorry, my mouse has submarined. There it is. Right, so it is different flying abroad. Not different bad, different good. People fly in a slightly different way. The communication is different. There's different vibe to what you're used to when flying in your club. The skill level sometimes is going to be different. You're going to be potentially on an airfield where everybody flies in a very similar way to the way that you fly, which can be quite good. You will be amongst people who have slightly different expectations of how to fly, what the responsibilities are. And this is something that I would like to talk about in a second session when we do sort of a more general session. It's around some of the things that you can do on your transmitter that make things much easier. The Germans particularly fly with quite a high reliance on their spotter. And that generates a particular style of flying. And the spotter becomes quite responsible with the pilot, which is something that we're perhaps not used to in the UK because we generally fly solo. So as spotter for a German pilot, you might need to be inputting more, giving them more information. You might need to be paying a bit more attention to whether they've looked away and looked back and seen the wrong aeroplane. You might become a bit more responsible for making sure that they don't overspeed their aircraft or fly the wrong aircraft. It's not something that I'm personally used to, and it was a bit of a learning curve calling for different people in some of the early events when I was there on my own and teamed up with someone from a different country. So you just need to ask questions, understand what the expectations are, and I'm going to cover that a bit more in the next slide. Okay, learn some German. So I hinted at this in the last, a couple of slides ago. So although the language is going to be English because it's an international competition, understanding German and French, and particularly the numbers and words for thermal and the words for the turn and where people are, can be quite useful, because of course you can pick up on someone maybe has found some lift and they're very quietly saying to their pilot, there's lift at turn point 2. Well, if you understand that, and the person who's saying that, the spotter, is next to you for the pilot who's next to you, you can use that information. So having a little bit of German that's appropriate to GPS triangle racing is quite useful. And the numbers are quite useful, because in the heat of the moment, people will call out altitudes in the language that is their first language, because it's faster. And obviously that could be quite important to you if you're an English-speaking pilot flying in the same thermal as someone who is getting a bit alarmed about the altitudes that you're at. So it's just worth having some numbers. Right. Mariana. At most of the big events, the World Championship events, you've probably seen that there's a pilot called Michael Kress. And Michael's mum is Mariana, and she is nearly always the flight line controller. So Mariana is your best friend. Mariana will be controlling the fixed frequency allocation. Mariana will know what time the flights are going to be. Mariana will know what's about to be written out on the board as the next working time and the next window time. So making friends with Mariana really makes your life a lot easier. Whoever the flight controller is, get to know who they are, know where they are, have a good relationship with them, because yes, they will help you, that's their job. But if you've got a really good relationship with them, it means that you can prep better. You can be prepared for your flight better. If there are things that are changing, you've turned up to go fly and to prepare for your flight, but there's something like midway through the day, a light aircraft is coming to the airfield and a slot is delayed for 30 minutes. If Mariana is your best friend and you have good communication, you will find that out. So you can go and have a rest for 30 minutes. And then you can go back and you can start looking at what the lift is doing, what the air mass is doing, because in 30 minutes it will have changed. You don't then have to waste your time standing on the side of the airfield and then suddenly thinking, okay, well, I've spent 15 minutes of my brain power looking at a lift cycle that is going to be changing because we're going through 1 o'clock and the lift cycle changes at 1 o'clock at this airfield. So stuff like that is really useful. Okay, so going and flying abroad, particularly for us in the UK, it will take your flying up a level in all sorts of different ways. You will become a more confident pilot. You will do stuff that you never thought you would do before. So I think, using Greg Lewis as an example, I think when we did the World Championships in Ulm, we flew in ways that I don't think either of us had flown GPS until we flew that competition. We flew more adventurously. We flew more aggressively. We tried things. We experimented with different methods of dealing with circumstances. and it improved our flying. It took our flying up a level. Because you're in a different environment, you've got different inputs, you're flying with different people, they have different ways of doing things. They've got experiences that we don't have, and you can, just by flying in that environment, improve your flying. So it's well worth going and doing that, if nothing else, just to improve your flying. So I hinted at this earlier. Socializing through the day, yeah, it's lovely, but actually you're there to compete. I generally suggest that most of your socializing, do it after your last flight. Your teammate, your spotter, you and your teammate will be joined at the hip pretty much for quite a lot of the period of time. So yes, you will inevitably socialize. You will talk about other things. It's a way of decompressing. But the problem with sort of having long, in-depth conversations about life, the universe, and toy planes is that you might suddenly find, you look at the time and think, oh, I've got 2 minutes to get my plane to the flight line ready for the start window. So you need to be a bit disciplined about that. And also, if you've got maintenance to do, make sure that you create the space, isolate yourself so that you can do that without interruption. So you don't make any mistakes, you don't get distracted. One of the reasons that I do these things is that it is a great way of meeting like-minded people from other countries, finding out about other countries, finding out about different experiences, getting to know different people, understanding the different worlds that they live in. And it's fantastic for that. But for the moment of the competition, my focus is on the flying. So I said I was going to come on to this. This is probably the most interesting question that came out of the what do you want to know about competing from the community. So the perfect co-pilot, coach, spotter, helper. Well, it starts with the pilot. You are a team, you work together. So what you need to do is you need to have that conversation. If you've never met your co-pilot before, the practice days are an ideal opportunity for you to actually maybe fly as a team, get used to each other, work out what you need. If you're very self-reliant, you might not need very much from them. If you need some help and support and you want someone to work with you, then you need to just work out where the boundaries are. You need to have some really clear communication about your expectations of each other. As you work as a team, you will also, over the course of the event, refine what you do. So one of the things is how joined the decision is going to be. If you're both fairly similar pilots, fairly similar in your approach to things, you might both just be providing reinforcement and support for each other's decisions. You might be in a position where you can have a dialogue as the pilot is flying around the triangle, where you're saying, okay, well, I think this is going to go on. And the pilot will be thinking, yes, I agree with this. And will say, yes, that was my plan. Or the pilot might say, my plan was this. At which point the spotter can go, okay, let's have a look at that plan. I will look here. I will tell you what's going on there. What information do you need to help you make that decision? But you need to work as a team. You need to understand how joint your decisions are going to be. Key thing as a pilot is show your spotter your albatross setup, what colours you use, because the chances are both of you as pilots will have very personal setups on your albatross, and it's very, very easy to make assumptions about what's in front of you on the albatross and feed the pilot wrong information, or for the pilot to assume that the spotter has seen something that they haven't because they're not used to the setup on your albatross. So again, practice days are a perfect place to do that. You only need to do it a couple of flights. We're all bright people. We will all pick up all of that sort of information. And that sort of leads into the next point. Make sure your pilot makes the turn point. So we talked about, I've sort of gone on about flying in thermals. If you've got a thermal that is just inside turn point 1, and it's going away from turn point 1 out of the course, the pilot is not going to be looking at their display. So one of the things that I do as a spotter now is, after a turn point, I will try and look at the pilot's display to make sure they've made the turn point. Because if there's a lot of stuff going on, it's very easy to miss the audio cue that you've made the turn, or you might think you've heard it because you've got so much going on around you. You've got all the other pilots talking, you've got your vario going, you've got all sorts of input coming into your ears, but you can't look at your display. It's a very simple thing which can save you a massive amount of frustration. And again, as a pilot, co-pilot team, there are other things that you might work out that you need to work on, that you as a pilot might require from your spotter, and your spotter might require from you when they're flying. And that's the point of having the discussions. It's about understanding what's required. At its very basic level, you need to be looking ahead for your pilot. You need to be looking for lift. You need to be seeing what other people are doing. You need to be able to see birds at a massive distance. You need to be looking both low down and high up. Also, you need to try and keep an awareness of what's going on with other people thermally. As I said earlier, if your pilot is flying in a straight line, say from turn point 3 to turn point 1, and there's a thermal above your head, your pilot is not going to be aware of that. But as a spotter, hopefully you will be aware that everybody's looking overhead, and you can guide your pilot around that thermal so they don't charge their sport class plane, scale plane, right through the middle of the thermal at the same altitude as everybody else. Because yes, as a pilot, you should be looking forward, but we've all got peaked caps. We're all looking for thermals. We might not be spatially aware of the fact that right overhead, the most difficult place to spot aeroplanes, there's a thermal, and there are people thermally. So you've got two pairs of eyes, and you need to make sure that you use them. So the spotter has also got to recognise every plane flying in the slot and know how well they're doing. So they've got to keep a mental tally of all the laps that every pilot has flown. Obviously, this is impossible. All you can do is fly your best flight as a pilot. All your spotter can do is respond to where you are. But spotting someone who is travelling at quite high speed, working out whether or not they went into the course at the same time as you, and whether or not they're on final glide and they're in good air, things like that are really important. So your spotter has got to look around. You've got to have a spotter who's ideally got eyes forward, backward, and in their ears. So it's quite a difficult thing to do to spot. So, as I say, be Yoda, know everything before it happens. It's a real challenge if you're not used to spotting. The danger with spotting, though, is that you can give too much information. And that goes back to the first point, really. As a pilot and a spotter combination, you've got to work out what each of you needs from each other. You've got to have that conversation. And whilst you might think something at the beginning of the competition, if it's your first competition, I guarantee you what you think you need will evolve. So have that dialogue, have a wrap up at the end of every day, how it went, what you think needs to be done differently. If you're happy with everything that's gone on, make sure that you reinforce it, support each other, and it will work very well in that case. I've been fortunate to spot for a number of people who have been at quite different ends of the spectrum, very, very capable pilots, and people who need quite a lot of input. And having to engage in different ways gives you some real insight as to what you might require. So there is no perfect solution, but have a dialogue with your pilot, understand their needs, think about what your needs are as a pilot from your spotter. If you're new to this and you're thinking of having a go at a competition abroad, the reality of it is maybe you need to ask Greg, Lewis, or myself for some time, and I'm happy to stand with you and do some spotting so that you can work out what inputs you want, where you want those inputs. So some people are happy to have their spotter talk to them as they go around a turn. Other people find it distracting and they don't want their spotter to talk to them 25 meters before a turn and 25 meters after a turn, because the workload for the pilot is such that they need to concentrate because they're pushing the plane right to the limit and they need to be really focused on making the turn. So there are all those sort of conversations that you need to have. So it's very difficult to be the perfect spotter. The only way you can do it is by working together to work out what works for each of you. One of the things that I would say is quite useful, unfortunately, I thought I'd got a photograph of it, but I haven't, is if you have a set of information on your trim settings as a pilot that you might have printed out and hung below your tablet, if you have a tablet, it's something that Thomas Schaub does. So whoever's spotting for Thomas has effectively a crib sheet of best speeds to fly that Thomas has worked out for his aeroplanes, and also how long it takes him to fly a lap within certain parameters of indexing, and how long it's going to take him to complete 5 laps. So something like that might be really helpful if you're not used to calculating that. And it might be useful for you to do that for your spotter if you think it will help your spotter calculate your final glide for you, if you want them to do that. So there are lots of subtleties around being a spotter, but the key thing is work as a team, understand what each of you need, what each of you can apply. And again, you don't necessarily need the best pilot in the world to be a spotter. So at the first scale event I flew at, my teammate exited quite early due to not being able to keep his aeroplane in one piece. So I was ostensibly going to be flying on my own, but Joss, my wife, came out to spot for me. And on at least 2 flights, her input saved me from the ignominy of very low score and sort of guaranteed high 800 scores with her ability to spot birds circling low level. Everybody was looking up and out. She spotted birds just beyond turn point 1 at about 70, 80 meters. And I think 3 of us managed to make that thermal. Everybody else landed. So your spotter just needs to look around and provide you the information that you need them to provide. So during the course of the flight, tell your spotter what you need at that moment in time. So last information slide, useful stuff. You may have picked up the psychology of going to compete and having a good time. Personally, I quite like Professor Steve Peters' view of the world. British cycling bought into his psychology. It's not massively different to any psychology, but he certainly was key to getting British cycling very good results out of the brittle people that are competitors. I quite like this book. I dip into it periodically. I remind myself of some of the contents of it. It helps me understand things that I can do that sabotage my behavior or my performance, and can therefore deflect the inner voices from sabotaging my performance. It might not be your thing, but I think it's quite useful. Hopefully, everybody on this event will know who that bloke is. That's Joe Wirtz. YouTube is littered with videos of Joe talking about finding lift, using lift. And I'm sure a lot of people are going to say, but that's that's a hand launch glider, a DLG. And a lot of his stuff is about DLG or F5J. But I watched one of Joe's videos the other day, and he said a couple of things, and I went, oh yeah, I'd forgotten all about that, which was really useful. It just reinforced something that is really useful when flying GPS, because yes, we generally fly at quite high altitude, but when you're at 120 meters, some of the things that Joe says about low level flying with a DLG absolutely apply in our world. So winter's here for the UK, and if the guys down in Oz are not allowed to go out because it's so hot no one's allowed to travel, go and watch Joe Wirtz video if you've got nothing else better to do, because you will learn something. There are lots of other videos about thermal flying and duration flying, but Joe's stuff is very good, so I do occasionally watch it. So the soaring engine, that might not mean anything to anybody, but I know a couple of people here do know the soaring engine. So it's a website, and there are 5 books, of which I think you need to probably beg, borrow, or buy the first 3. They're written by a chap called Gerard Dale. And a long time ago, I got to know Gerard, because his mother bought a car from the main dealership that I worked at, and I delivered it back to her after a service to find a libelle in the shed in her back garden. And the week before, her youngest son had just joined the garage as a mechanic and said, oh, when you deliver that car back, you might find a glider in the shed in the back garden. And my brother, who's G. Dale, who's a very accomplished glider flyer and a coach, he's written a series of books called The Soaring Engine. And they cover all sorts of stuff, but it is about competition cross-country flying in full size. But the beauty of the books is that they're really simple and they get all the key concepts across without any flim-flam. It's really easy to grasp and understand. So for competition flying, they're a good bedtime read. They're something that I dip in and out of quite regularly. It's interesting reading, and I can recommend them. Something else I think that's really important, I use Windy as an app. This is another app, but what you need to find, and I know Simon, who's looking intently at this, but Simon has, well, some of the things that Simon does before a competition, I know I've talked about. He looks at an OS map in the old days. He looks at where the lift sources are. These days, Simon will do what I do, and others will do. Look at the weather forecast. Find an application that gives you hourly updates of the weather, particularly thermal generation, where the thermals are going to be strongest, what strengths the thermals are expected to be at different levels. Find one that you trust. So you're going to have to try 2 or 3. You're going to kiss a few frogs that aren't going to turn into princes, but you will find one that works for you. So I use Windy because I found that works generally quite well for me and gives a fairly reliable idea of what thermal strength to expect, how the thermal generation is going to go on through the day. It's just about feeding the mental model of what's going on the day for competition, for challenge cup flying, whatever it is, so that you know what you're going into. It's just a way of improving your picture of the world. And finally, I occasionally noodle around on the internet having a look for interesting articles. So this one, the intuition of McCready setting, was particularly interesting. We don't have McCready per se, but the reality of it is we've all got fairly active brains. We're already doing quite a lot of the calculation ourselves, particularly when we get to the latter third of the flight, going, how much height do I need? How fast can I fly this? Have I got 1 minute 20-second lap speed and height? Do I need to be flying 1 minute 30 laps because I can't afford to lose the extra 5 meters a lap? Reading stuff around it, understanding what's going on, improving how your internal model works can be done by reading some of this stuff and working out how you're going to use the information that the Albatross is giving you. Do you need all of the information in the Albatross? Can you slim down the amount of information that you take from Albatross? So there are some pilots I know, particularly a couple of guys from Germany, who bombard themselves with information, and I don't think it improves their flying. There are others who have a very simplistic view and they fly really well because they have flown enough that they fly instinctually to the sort of McCready model of getting their final glide and their climbs right. There's one of the flights from the World Championships, which I will try and dig out for future reference, where Florian Grieser absolutely flew the whole flight as though he had a McCready computer updating every triangle. He flew an amazing flight that was blisteringly efficient without the aid of any tools other than the calls from his spotter and his instinct to fly. And even Philip Cole, who was, I think, flying at the same time, said it was a really good piece of flying. So all of this stuff that I've sort of put up here, this is just about lifting your underlying skills, which will help you when you go and compete in the wider environment, compete internationally.
It's good.
So that's it, the end. Any questions?
So should we just cover Stephen's question off about getting altitude on demand on your jetty and how you do it?
Right. So in simple terms, don't have the back channel compressed from the Albatross. It's rubbish as a backup because the Yeti back channel is shite. I like Yeti radio. I think they're brilliant, but they have a gaping flaw that the back channel is just not got enough bandwidth. It's not like the power box. The power box has a fantastic bandwidth and the back channel is a credible backup, except the fact that unless you've got two systems in your aircraft, you have no backup using the Yeti back channel. But if you decompress the Yeti back channel, you get all of the readouts as usable, readable data fields. So you can have your, if you've got airspeed, you can have airspeed. If you've got barometric altitude, you can have barometric altitude. So I set up the barometric altitude to be read out as a voice prompt, which you can do via the single action voice prompts in Yeti. I think it's under sounds in the menu. And I just set a button up with speed and altitude. Well, I've got one button with speed and I've got one button with altitude. I also have readouts, voice readouts on the telemetry for things like battery voltage and milliamps used on a couple of my aeroplanes where the power usage is quite critical. So it's all stuff that's very easy to do. Much easier to do if you've got a DS because you've got buttons on the back. It's one of the reasons that I swapped to a DS, to be honest, because it meant that I could use these single push buttons. The thing that makes it workable is that, as I said before, in the sound files for your language, you will find that there is a sound file that says altitude. And if you set a single voice prompt on a button for the altitude, what will happen is the Yeti will read out the voice file that says altitude. So it'll say altitude, and then it will tell you the number of meters. So I found that if you delete the altitude voice file, because you don't need it, you know when you push that button on every aeroplane, if you set it up properly, that the only number that is going to come out of that is a 3-digit number, which is going to be the altitude in meters. And I've got it set to the barometric one. It will just give you 3 numbers and it'll say meters at the end of it, which means that you get a virtually, it's not instantaneous, but you get within 1.5 seconds, you get the barometric altitude. So if you're flying on your own, you know what altitude you're at. So that's quite useful for doing the start. If you've got a really busy start line, you don't really want to be taking your eyes off the aeroplane. So I find that I can just push the button. I never have to look away from the plane in thermals. I never have to look away from the plane in starts because I've got speed and altitude as voice outputs. So what I can do as a follow-up in the next day or so is I will just jot down the pathway to go and the albatross fields to look at. The slide I put up with useful stuff, I was going to actually put that up as just the links up for people to go and have a look at anyway. So I'll just add this to that and we'll put it in the documents on the Facebook group.
Great. Thank you.
Does that answer your question, Stephen?
Yes, thank you very much. That's something I've learned today, which I think will be very useful.
Well, so so several things. I think obviously it's not too late and we can go on talking, no problem. I want to say thank you to Iain for all the work that he put into preparing that. He's obviously streaming something now because his video slowed down. So that, thank you from all of us for presenting. We do want to have another session in 3 or 4 weeks' time. It's wet, it's dark, the evenings haven't really drawn out, and we're trying to keep people enthusiastic about having a go at GPS this summer and being in good shape for it. So one of the things I throw out two things I throw out is, are there any other questions? And Rolf actually asked you about psychology, and I knew what was coming up because I'd seen the slides, but that Steve Peters stuff is exceptional, and I can be a little bit involved with it because I've been involved with British cycling, and for the Aussies on tonight, Victoria Pendleton was up against Anna Mears in the Athens Olympics in 2004, and she was in the warm-up room and she was so nervous she tried to run out through the fire exit, which happened to be locked with a padlock on the outside, and Steve Peters talked her down and she went on to beat Anna Mears in that sprint final and got a gold medal. So, and he would tell you the story about that was the chimp on her shoulder taking over and the human not thinking straight. So his Chimp Paradox is a brilliant book, and if you haven't read it, I'd really highly recommend reading it. So because might not have seen the question, Ian, but Ralph said, can we have discussion in the next one by a sports psychologist? So he sort of covered it off really nicely. So hang on, there's a new message popped up. Ralph's given thumbs up and a smiley. So what I would like to do, and then maybe tonight we can get it sort of some of it on the table. If not, please message me or Ian or any of the other people on the like Simon. We'd like to have a session next time, much more about you guys asking your questions. There are no stupid questions in this, and we've got people on tonight. We've had a really good turnout. We had 23 people at one point. 1 or 2 people ducked out. That's understandable. And we've got people who, like Ian, have been to a number of events. We've got John Greenfield, who's podiumed in a World Masters. Through to people just starting their journey, like Chris Lodge. So, any questions that people want to ask, be great. And if we can have them before next meeting, that would be really good. So, but has anyone got a question they'd like to pose for tonight or for in preparation for next meeting?
If no one else says anything, I'll say something. One thing I'd like to talk about probably for next time is the sort of maybe subtle differences between flying a light class triangle and flying a sport class triangle. The techniques or the strategies may be just subtly different. And I know Iain has flown both, and others maybe have flown both. I certainly fly both, and I find myself using slightly different styles between the two. So maybe a bit of discussion around that might be of interest.
Really good. Okay.
So I agree, Simon. I think one of the things that we might try offline before we do it for real is when we first started this, I was thinking of maybe putting edited video capture of a couple of flights from the World Championships in Zell together, so that we could maybe just sort of talk about some of the reasons why people got good scores and people didn't get good scores, because you can, from the recording and having been at the event in the flight, sort of talk about some of the strategies that you would adopt. And yes, they would probably be different if you're flying light class. But I think that is a good thing to do. And if we can get some video capture, I'm happy for people to look at my mistakes and tell me what I did wrong. Because I think, again, thinking about strategy, it's a bit like the psychology, and it's a bit like working out the terrain and the lift sources. All the stuff you do prior to competition is building your knowledge, so that when you land, you're better prepared.
Yeah, I think it's impossible. We tried it before on Zoom, and you were actually in your slide, you got an animated slide at the end with the plane landing, and it didn't really play properly. So it's just no, not worth it. Okay. We had a question about lipos and what you can take on the plane. I put an answer in on that. We got another message. Interested transmitter setup around flight modes. Okay, Rob, fire away. What would you like to know?
Hi, Greg. Yeah, I'm just starting to looking at using flight modes and various things for things like thermal and speed. And I don't really understand what I'm trying to achieve.
That's good. That's 2 of us.
I mean, I understand the mechanics, but what I don't understand is what effect I'm looking for on the glider.
Okay. Well, I suppose, have you watched John Copeland's and John Greenfield's first seminars that we did during COVID that are on YouTube, and I posted before on the UKGPS webpage? Have you watched those ones?
Yes, I have. I've seen them a couple of times, and I'm just a little confused. That's all.
Right. So, okay, I'm not being difficult. What are you finding confusing?
Just understanding how far I need to take some of the settings, I tend to end up certainly in speed if I'm not careful with an aircraft which is descending very rapidly, but not necessarily flying very efficiently.
Are you using negative flap on your light class plane?
Yes,
Okay.
only about two mil.
All right. Probably too much. Well, we,
Yes.
What plane is it?
1.9 mil too much.
Yeah,
Sorry,
what plane is it?
It's
Rob?
an An Explorer 5.
So it's a good plane, Simon, and Rob and I have flown together a few times because we live literally we live a small drone flight away from each other, and he's come to
Yes.
Hadnam, and we're members of another club as well. So it's got exceptionally large surfaces on it. It's like a big flat. No, it's a very nice
Yeah.
plane. It's got a lot of potential, I think, actually.
I mean, I would say for starters, till you're confident of flying triangles and keeping good courses, keeping reasonable speeds, consistent speeds, I would say don't go with any negative flap.
Yep.
I don't use much negative flap, if any, when I'm flying my light class.
Yeah, I've literally hardly ever used my flight modes. They're set up for thermal and speed as per the instructions, but I very rarely use them, and it's probably something I need to look at.
Okay, so I mean, this is so personal, but I think it is actually quite simple. Typically, if you watch that video and the way John Greenfield coached us, and it was like it was sort of an epiphany for me. I was doing F5B before I did GPS triangle racing, and I used to use 5 flight modes in that. But you know, the difference is that's a 13-minute flight, of which the intense part of it is not very long. It's a couple of minutes, the speed part of it. And that is incredibly intense because the plane's doing 300. You've seen it. That's 300 kilometers an hour for parts of it. This is different. However, what I would say is anyone who's ever flown over 20, well, anyone who's ever flown 16, 17, knocking on 20, 21, 20, actually, that requires an incredible amount of concentration. The plane can typically quite high, and simplicity and consistency of your flight modes is essential because it is just the fast and the furious. And then when you start flying man on man, and you've been to, man on man, you came to Phoenix, and you saw it and you called for me, which was great because I got the advantage. I had a caller and nobody else did, and you got to sort of see it. And Simon still beat all of us that day, even though I had a caller. I would say the basic premise, which is you have 3 flight modes, which is a thermal flight mode. So let's take the expression speed out of it, because speed is another task within GPS triangle race. One of that we're talking about a fast distance glide mode.
Yep.
So in really simple terms, what I do is I have a duration mode, which if I flick my plane into duration mode, I get my duration flap, and the plane is trimmed to fly perfectly like that. I then have a separate slider, and I can slide my flap to what I call a super flap setting. And that slider also triggers a difference in the trim to compensate for the fact that there is more down flap than there is in your normal perfect thermal soaring 3 duration mode. Okay. And so the reason I do that is that if you're flying along really fast and you hit a thermal, you can go into your duration mode, you can put your flap down, and you can gain 80, 90, 100 meters, one by the zoom effect, but secondly, you can just fly in a straight line and the thing will ride up. And then I'll go back into a fast glide mode. And then I think John Greenfield, where he comes from on it and sort of coached us on that Zoom call, is you then have 2 further modes, which are your fast glide modes. And one of them is where the plane just starts to move on nicely with no, as Simon says, no reflex, just the wing in its neutral position for now.
Yep.
And that gives you just a very slight dive. Okay.
Yep.
Now, when you, with the light class plane, because at the moment that's what you've got, if you start hitting lift where the thing's going up at 2.5, 3 meters a second, and you really want to start scorching around the sky, you then have a further fast glide mode where you flick the switch and you have slightly more down trim. Okay, and the plane will go. But obviously, if you're encountering much stronger lift, that if you're just testing that out in still air, the plane will dive quite significantly, maybe 10,
Yep.
15 degree angle. In lift, it won't. And actually, with a light class plane, even when you've got a trim where it's diving at 15 degrees, 20 degrees in still air, it may just fly flat across the sky in strong lift.
Yep.
Okay. So those are the three, I would say, get yourself, as Simon says, get yourself a really well trimmed plane, three simple flight modes. The ergonomics of anything you do with it are really simple. So with a 3-position switch, and if you're going to use a slider to increase your flap in your duration mode, or to I don't have like a 5-position switch. I actually do use reflex on sometimes on my sports class plane, and I'm experimenting with it with a light class. I use that slider to do that. But you've got to remember, as soon as you change the flap, you're going to change the trim in your flight mode, and you need to be able to
Yes.
mix that out. So, just on that final point, on my duration and my super flat mode, I will go into duration, or I'll be flying on really fast, and I go into duration. I think, oh, that's good lift. Actually, I'm going to bang a whole load of flat down and have a massive zoom up and take an example of it. What actually happens is, as the speed bleeds off, you'll find with all the sports class planes that I've ever flown, is that actually your trim settles back to the same trim as your normal duration flap. So I have a trim that gives me more down trim as I put the slider on, and then it backs off as a part of a mix. And when we meet up, I can show you that. Or I could show, certainly for the next thing, I could do some screenshots of my mixes, if you like, so people can see it. But you don't need to get into that complexity. Just get 3 really good flight modes. One you can duration fly in really well, one that you can fly moderately fast in, and one that you can fly really fast in that's diving more. Then, every time you fly, you go to the field, the weather will be different, the wind speed will be different, and the wind direction to the course will be different. You'll have to retrim every time you go to the field for that day. And I would suggest I find with a carbon fiber fuselage long tailbone model, which most of these planes have, unless you've got the servo at the back of the fuselage, through the day, your trim will change. Okay,
Yeah.
so if you watch Greg Fitzpatrick fly, he takes off, he goes up to, with his sports class plane, up to about 150 meters. He turns the motor off, and every flight he retrims the flight to where he's comfortable with for the conditions at that moment he's flying in.
Yep.
Okay, so it's not a thing where, oh, I've got 3 really nice trims here, I'm just going to leave it at that. For it to work, you need to retrim pretty much, or just check your trim every time you'll fly. And you'll find, as I say, if you've got a long tail boom plane with a carbon fiber pushrod, the trim will change during the day anyway.
Right.
And that's where quite often you get a discrepancy. You fly a plane, you think that was really good the last flight. It's not. That's because your trim's changed, because the fuselage, is lengthened at a different length to the pushrod.
Yes.
So I don't know. Is that maybe sets you off on a path, but keep it simple.
Yep. Thank
Can
you.
I just add, Greg?
So yeah,
Can I add to that? Greg?
of course you can.
So, Rob, one of the things that's quite interesting when you fly abroad is, and I've been doing this, rather than having some of the names, if you set your flight modes up and you call it distance, best glide, something like that, and minimum sink and thermal, that sort of helps you appreciate what you're trying to do with the flight mode. So if you set thermal, that's Greg uses duration, but thermal is going to be your sort of climb trim. But if you have a best glide and a minimum sink as labels for your flight mode, which keeps it simple, you know what you're using those flight modes for.
Yep.
So best glide is effectively your distance flight mode. And you might have a sub mode in each of those. Possibly, you might not. But then you can have a speed flight mode as well. So I do something very similar to Greg. I just use slightly different labeling. But by having it say when you select the flight mode, again, I use the audio in the Yeti transmitter, when I put it into distance, I know that that is the glider traveling. When I put it into minimum sink, I know that that is it's a precursor to my duration flight mode, but I'm trying to hang on to some height, and it just reinforces in your head. This again is part of the psychology of flying, I would say, is making things reinforce. And when you listen to some of the continental flyers, not only do they have distance, when it says distance in their transmitter, it also calls out the speed range that the aircraft is going to fly at. And that's a subtlety that is worth starting to engage with, because when you start to understand the flight speeds of your aircraft in these different flight modes, the air speeds of your aircraft in these different flight modes, it helps reinforce the fact that you might be lingering in the wrong flight mode for a period of time.
Yep.
So it just helps you select the right flight mode. And practice and experience is one of the ways that you just get used to knowing which flight mode to put the aircraft in to maximise the performance.
Can I ask Rolf, you've got a question here. Flap is used as any management system. Do you want to expand on that, please?
Greg, yeah, just from my full size flying from many years ago, I was always taught that, and I think it was explained to me that whatever flap setting you're in, whether it's negative flap, zero flap, or cruise mode, as I call it, and thermal mode, and I've been told to keep it simple, that the flap setting is designed for whatever band of speed you're flying, which is what Iain said there before. So yeah, he's probably explained it. I just thought I'd chuck in that that's what I've learned in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a question here from John. Thank you, Rolf. John Minchell, which says, what's the new light class wing loading for 200 for 2025? Well, there isn't a new wing loading. It stays the same, John. But there's going to be a couple of exploratory events, and we can run an event in the UK or two if we want to, where the wing loading is going to go from 30 grams per square decimeter to 33 grams per square decimeter. And actually, I think we'll actually, because it's knocking on, but in the next session, I think we can talk about. Iain was sort of alluding to that there may be some changes to the light class and the rules and things coming up. So we could kick that around. But your wing loading at 30 grams, surface loading at 30 grams per square decimeter is fine. You don't need to do anything about it.
If I'm struggling with keeping it down to 30 though, and it's now going to be 33, that gives me.
It's not going to be 33. It's 30.
You just said it's going to be 33.
No, I didn't. I said it's 30, and there are in Europe, there's some experimental eurotour events which are going to be at 33, and if they're successful and people are happy with it, they may change the rules for 2026.
Okay, thank you.
I think the thing to watch out for there is it doesn't sound much. It's only 10%, but it's quite a big difference in weight. And I mean, like a 2PK Pro will be nearly 3 kilos fully ballasted against the new things. That's quite a strain on the motors and things that are designed generally for models that were 1.5 kilos or so, particularly with a 250 meter climb. So I'm worried that people are going to start burning motors out. So you might need to rethink about motors and speed controllers and things.
Or prop size.
True, yeah.
With a smaller prop.
Yeah.
And on what you were saying, John, I had there's a message floating around from Benjamin Dan, who's involved with this, and I think there will be further discussion on this. I think there's increasing pressure on the GPS organisation, so I think watch this space. And in the interests of openness, so one of the reasons I quite like having a light class plane is that I can ballast it to over 3 kilograms and make it feel like a sport class plane to fly. So I can chuck a 3 kilogram plane, fly it, and it simulates flying the sport class plane without having to put a 7 kilogram plane together, go to a field which is flat enough to fly a 7 kilogram field without long grass. So there's a real benefit to having a light class plane that will take the ballast, because once you fill the ballast tube of a 2 PK Pro full, it is a different beast. It's a very interesting beast to fly, and it does feel like flying a Paradigm. So it's perfect as a training plane for me.
Cool. Yeah, I go back to, is it about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, when light class was first announced, and I know Simon complained, and I complained as well online about the proposed set of rules, because the 30 gram per decimeter squared, we felt, certainly for our conditions in the UK, was going to be way too light, and that is basically, what that class is tarred with is you're flying a paper bag, even if it's fully ballasted, compared to a sport class model, which is over twice the weight and only an extra meter on the wingspan, and handles a totally different beast.
So I think what and I've said this to you, John, what you have to realise is, Nick, you can see it from the league results, is that the powerhouse to all the decision making on this is obviously Germany, Switzerland and Austria, but particularly Germany. And they had a very windy summer, and the winning score in the light class was one of the lowest on the league, one of the lowest scores since the league's been going. And I think suddenly people have had a rude awakening that, in Central Europe, they've had some English weather right through the summer. It makes those planes very sort of boring and difficult to fly. You can only do 1 or 2 laps if the wind's up at sort of 20, 25 miles. And well, you don't fly, but let's say it's 15 to 20. And so this is why there's an adaptation of it. But it's a fine balancing act for them, because if they put the weight up too much, then people will start designing effectively F3B type planes.
Yeah.
And it kills the whole concept of being trying to sort of have a starter class where you've got someone who's got an F5J plane, and then they can put a bit of ballast in it and it becomes a GPS light plane. If we start getting up over the 3 kilos, 3.5 kilos, the type of plane you'd have for it would be completely different, and you'd have a specialized plane, and it'd be costing £3,500-4,000, and so you might as well buy a Paradigm anyway at that point. So it's got some real subtleties to it, the other thing that's happening, of course, is that the designs that are coming out now, like the PK2 Pro, they do fly really well, and they are very, very fast, and they've got a great glide angle, and with a bit of ballast in, they're not too bad. So I think they'll have a go with it, and they'll change it to 33, but I can't see it going much higher than that.
Okay, thank you.
Let me just, because I've been wobbling on, let me just see if there are any more questions. So, okay, it's 10 o'clock in now. We had a fantastic session. Lots of great questions have come out of it. If anyone gets something that they like to ask come up, ping it through to me. I need to liaise with Dick to make sure we can get the Zoom again, but probably in about 4 weeks' time, we'll have another one, and it'll be around in the pub. You guys fire some questions in. You've got Simon, you've got Iain, you've got some, really great experience here. John Copeland and the Aussie guys, they're doing really well now. Steve Maitland's in the 20s lap club, which is fantastic to see. And it's one of those things it's hard to explain to someone. And I said this to Paul Eisner once. Paul said, how do you get to have the skills to fly 20 laps? I said, you can't do it until you do it. You can practice as much as you like. It's one of those things where until it actually happens and you make a few mistakes and you do a 16 and a 17, you think, if I flew a bit better and I'd flown a bit faster and I hadn't been so greedy with my altitude, I'd have done a 20. And to see Steve do that is fantastic. So we've got a wealth of experience available to us. So, think about your questions. Don't be shy. As I said, there's no stupid questions. And let's reconvene in about 4 weeks' time. So, again,
sorry, Greg, and in 6 weeks' time, which is pretty short time scale, we've got that trial at that new site as well, up in Shropshire.
Yeah. Yes, and thank you for your hard work on that.
No, you're welcome.
Right, so good night, everyone, and batten down the hatches. It's going to be another wet and rubbishy week in the UK, and we look with envy at the scores in Australia at the moment. So have a good time down there.